The rain hammered relentlessly against the windows of the old house, the sound like the soft drum of 1,000 tiny fists pounding on the glass. Inside, the room was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the very air was holding its breath. The house groaned with every gust of wind, the floorboards creaking and shifting as though the house itself were alive. But it was the silence between those sounds, the heavy, suffocating quiet, that made Sarah uneasy. It was late, far too late for anyone to be awake in this old mansion. Yet Sarah couldn't sleep. She hadn't been able to for days. Something about the house, about the doll, kept her awake, kept her watching, kept her waiting for something terrible to happen. And it always did. She glanced across the room where the doll sat motionless on a dusty old chair, its porcelain face pale and cracked in places, a faint scar where the paint had chipped away. The doll was small, no taller than a foot, but it seemed to dominate the room, filling the space with a presence that felt too large for its size. Its eyes were the most unsettling thing about it. Dark, deep, hollow, but somehow alive, like they were watching her every move. She knew it was ridiculous. Dolls didn't move, didn't watch people. But that didn't make her feel any less. Terrified. "Get a grip, Sarah," she muttered under her breath, though her voice seemed to disappear into the heavy silence. It hadn't been long ago that Sarah had inherited the house. It was an old family estate, inherited through generations, and it had been sitting vacant for years after her grandmother's death. The house was a relic of a bygone era, its faded wallpaper and creaky wooden floors a testament to its age. Sarah wasn't entirely sure why she had decided to keep it. Perhaps it was the memories of childhood summers spent here, or the nagging feeling that this house with its deep hidden history was calling to her. Either way, she moved in with the idea of restoring it, of breathing new life into the neglected rooms. When she found the doll, it was in the attic, buried beneath old boxes and piles of forgotten keepsakes. It had been wrapped carefully in a faded cloth, and for a moment Sarah hesitated before touching it. There was something about the way it had been stored, as though it was something precious, something valuable. She carefully unwrapped it and examined the doll. It was beautiful, if unsettling. Its porcelain face was meticulously crafted, its delicate features sharp and lifelike. But the eyes, they were too real, too human. She shivered but shrugged it off, placing the doll on the chair in her bedroom. It was just a doll. And yet, as the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was more than just an innocent relic. It seemed to have a life of its own, a presence that crept into her thoughts, unsettling her at every turn. At first, it was little things. A door left ajar when she was sure she had closed it. A faint whisper of a sound she couldn't quite place. It wasn't enough to make her think something was wrong, but it was enough to make her feel uncomfortable. But when she woke up one morning to find the doll sitting at the foot of her bed, facing her with those unblinking eyes, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "That's not possible," she whispered to herself, walking over to it, trying to shake off the sense of dread that seemed to settle over her. She had left the doll on the chair in the corner of the room. There was no way it could have moved. And yet there it was, sitting neatly on the bed as if it had been placed there deliberately. Sarah had never believed in supernatural occurrences, never bought into the ghost stories or haunted house tales that had plagued her childhood. But as she looked down at the doll, her heart began to race. Was she imagining things? Had she sleepwalked and moved it without remembering? Or was there something far more sinister at work? Over the next few days, strange occurrences began to escalate. The doll's position seemed to change each time Sarah entered the room. Sometimes it was sitting on the chair, staring blankly at the wall. Other times it was standing on the shelf, its tiny hands outstretched. But it was always facing her, those dark eyes following her every move. The whispers started then too. Soft, faint voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes they sounded like a child's giggle, other times like a muffled voice calling her name. She would try to ignore it, but it felt as though the house itself was pressing in on her, suffocating her with its secrets. The worst was yet to come. One evening, as Sarah sat in the living room reading, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just a faint murmur anymore. No, it was a distinct voice, low and eerie, carrying a tone of something ancient and malevolent. "Sarah, help me." She froze, the book slipping from her hands. Her heart thudded in her chest as she scanned the room. There was no one there, only the stillness, only the doll, sitting in the corner, eyes glinting in the half-light. The voice had come from somewhere, inside her mind. It was as though the words had been whispered directly into her thoughts, but there was something more, something deeper. It wasn't just a plea for help. It was an invitation, a temptation to succumb to whatever force lingered. In the house, the air grew thick and the room seemed to close in on her. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling, and tried calling Michael. But the line was dead. No signal. Her throat tightened, and she felt a wave of dizziness sweep over her. Then, with a sudden rush of panic, she darted toward the door. But as her hand reached for the doorknob, it stopped cold. The door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, the door remained locked. That's when she heard the laugh, soft but unmistakable. The same high-pitched giggle of a child, except there was something wrong about it. It wasn't playful. It was sinister. "Help me," the voice whispered again, only this time it sounded closer. Behind her. Desperate, Sarah knew she needed to find out more about the house, more about the doll. The following morning she visited the local library, hoping to uncover some kind of explanation for the strange happenings. The librarian, an elderly woman with thin silver hair and sharp eyes, led her to a dusty shelf in the back, where old town records were kept. She handed Sarah a thick yellowed book titled The Haunting of King's Hollow. The book contained stories of tragedies, strange disappearances, and cursed objects in the town's history. One chapter stood out, The Curse of Annabelle. It told the tale of a young girl named Annabelle, whose life had been tragically cut short by an illness. Her family had been devastated by her death, but they had found comfort in the doll they had given her, a beautifully crafted porcelain figure that Annabelle had loved dearly. However, after the girl's death, strange things began to happen. The doll was said to be haunted by her spirit, and it was said to bring misfortune to anyone who came into contact with it. Sarah's hands shook as she read the details of the curse. The doll had been passed from family to family, and each new owner had suffered some form of tragedy. A mother who lost her child, a father who disappeared without a trace. And now, it seemed, the curse had come to claim Sarah. The whispers grew, louder, and the laughter, once innocent, turned mocking and cruel. The doll's presence became unbearable. Sarah tried to burn it, to destroy it, but it was always there, always watching. No matter where she hid it, the doll would reappear, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Finally, she reached her breaking point. One night, unable to stand the torment any longer, she locked herself in her bedroom with the doll. The room felt colder than it ever had before, and the darkness seemed to press in from every corner. Sarah grabbed a knife, the cold steel feeling, strangely comforting in her trembling hands. She approached the doll, determined to end it once and for all. But as she raised the knife, the doll's eyes glowed red. The room trembled, the walls cracked, and the very air seemed to swirl with an otherworldly force. With a cry, Sarah plunged the knife into the doll's chest. For a moment, everything went still. The house was silent, eerily so. But then, the walls began to crumble, the house shaking with an unholy fury. And as the doll's body shattered, Sarah realized the truth. The doll was not just a cursed object, it was a vessel, a conduit for something far more powerful, something far older. And as the walls closed in around her, she understood that the curse would never end. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribcage as the doll's form cracked under the pressure of the knife. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just an intense, deafening silence that swallowed everything. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward her like dark, malevolent fingers. The room started to shake. The walls vibrated with an almost imperceptible hum, and the very foundation of the house seemed to groan in agony. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath ragged as she looked at the doll's broken form, the knife still buried, deep in its chest. She had done it. She had destroyed the source of her torment, or so she thought. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness, a thick, oppressive blackness that felt alive, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. She reached out, trying to find the door, but it was gone. There was nothing but that oppressive, malignant dark, the kind that pressed against your soul and made you feel as if you were no longer in control of your own body. Then, a sound broke the silence, a faint whisper just barely audible but unmistakable. It was a voice. No, not a voice, a presence. "You can't escape me." The words slithered into her mind, filling her head with a terrible, aching pressure. And with that voice came the unmistakable sound of something else, a slow, deliberate scratching. The sound of something moving, something in the room with her. Sarah's pulse raced as she scrambled to move, but her body felt like it was stuck in mud, slow and uncooperative. The scratching grew louder, and she realized with a jolt that it was coming from the doll. The remnants of it, the shattered porcelain, the ruined fabric, began to shift. Slowly, impossibly, the pieces were moving back together as though the doll was reassembling itself, its limbs snapping back into place, its head tilting upward. No, no, no. It couldn't be happening. The doll was coming back to life. The eyes were glowing now. Red. A deep blood red that seemed to burn with anger, with a force that was beyond anything human. "I am Annabelle," the voice whispered again, louder this time with a chilling authority. "I never leave, I never die." The doll stood whole again, its porcelain form smooth and perfect, its eyes fixed directly on her. But Sarah couldn't move, couldn't escape. The terror clamped around her chest like a vice, suffocating her, stealing her breath. She could feel the presence growing, rising up around her, thick like a storm about to burst. And then, a scream. It was her own scream, but it didn't feel like hers. It felt as though something else was trying to rip itself out of her throat. The doll's mouth opened, stretching unnaturally wide, as if it were about to devour her very soul. "Please," Sarah gasped, her voice barely audible. "Please, leave me alone." But the doll, Annabelle, didn't answer. Instead, it started to move toward her, its tiny feet scraping against the floor in a way that sounded almost too slow, almost too methodical. Sarah tried to run, but her legs betrayed her. She stumbled, falling to the floor with a thud, her head pounding as the dark forces around her closed in. It was over. She knew it. There was no escaping the curse. No way to break free. Annabelle reached her, standing over her like some malevolent god, its smile wide and mocking, stretching impossibly across its face. And then, the doll's voice spoke again, and this time, it was filled with pure malice. "You were never meant to leave." Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of pain, there was nothing. A strange weightlessness, as though her very being was being pulled from her body. The air around her seemed to thrum, vibrating with an energy so dark and ancient that it made her skin crawl. Her body was no longer her own, her mind slipping away from her grasp. She tried to scream again, but no sound came. It felt as though the very essence of her soul was being siphoned out, being absorbed into the doll, into the cursed entity that was Annabelle. Then, a sudden jolt, a flash of light. Sarah gasped for air, her lungs filling with the heavy, stagnant air of the room. The doll, Annabelle, had stopped moving. Its smile faded, and for a moment, the room seemed to go still, the oppressive weight lifting. But then, something strange began to happen. The walls, the floor, the very house began to change. The windows flickered with an eerie glow as if some unseen force was illuminating the outside world in unnatural hues. It was then that Sarah understood. This house, this place, was not just cursed. It was a gateway, a conduit for the doll's power, for whatever evil force had taken root in this place long ago. Annabelle was not just a doll. It was a being of unimaginable darkness, a vessel for something far worse than any human could comprehend. And it had chosen Sarah, not just to haunt, but to possess. The realization hit her like a wave. The stories in the book hadn't just been warnings, they had been the truth. The doll never truly let go of its victims. It consumed them body and soul, taking everything they were, until only an empty husk remained. And Sarah, poor Sarah, had been marked from the moment she set foot in the house. The air in the room turned colder still, and as Sarah looked toward the doll, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Annabelle was no longer alone. Around it, in the shadows, figures began to emerge. Tall, gaunt, shadowy shapes that flickered and twisted like smoke. They were like phantoms, or worse, spirits of the cursed souls who had come before her. They reached toward her, their hands grasping hungrily, desperate for her soul. "Join us," the voice of Annabelle whispered one last time, as the doll's eyes burned into her very being. And as the figures closed in around her, Sarah's scream echoed through the house, filling the air with terror, with anguish. The doll's curse had claimed yet another victim, and soon the house would claim more. It was never over. The rain had stopped by the time Michael arrived at the house. He stood at the front door, knocking repeatedly, calling Sarah's name, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The house was silent, too silent. The furniture lay in disarray as though it had been disturbed recently. The air was thick with dust, the shadows hanging heavy and unnatural. He walked through the rooms calling out for Sarah, his heart sinking with each passing minute. But there was no sign of her, only the oppressive, suffocating silence. Finally, he reached the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as he pushed it open, he froze. There, in the middle of the room, was the doll, Annabelle, sitting on the bed, staring at him with its cold, lifeless eyes. And in that moment, Michael felt the chilling truth sink into his bones. He wasn't alone. The house had claimed Sarah, and now it would claim him too. As the door creaked shut behind him, the doll's eyes glowed with a malevolent gleam. The curse had found its new victim. The end was just the beginning.